Joining us on the line now is record producer, music manager, author and filmmaker Simon Napier Bell. He's managed artists as diverse as the Yardbirds, Japan, Sinead O'Connor, Ultravox and Wham. He's directed a new documentary called The Real George Michael, which was released on June the 25th. That would have been George's 60th birthday. It gives a real insight into his amazing life, told by the people who knew him best. Welcome to the show, Simon.
It's good to be here.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you with us. And wow, it must have been quite the experience putting this documentary together.
It was wonderful. I mean, my idea was to get people who knew him, worked with him, wrote songs with him, sang his songs, and friends, family, and then have them talk, edit it down and have no commentary, just let these people tell the story from beginning to end, with a lot of archive material from him joining in with it too. And it was fantastic. And the people I got were wonderful. And people like Rufus Wainwright, Stephen Fry, Stevie Wonder, great gang of people.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see when these people in the public eye that we don't know ourselves, but we think we know, and we kind of assume and hope that they're really great people. And when they die, it's really interesting what people say about them. And it really seems like he was one of the good guys. I mean, literally everybody just has such wonderful things to say about him, which is really nice to see.
Yes, we interviewed 45 people, and we couldn't find anyone to say anything bad about him. I mean, there were people who had arguments with him or you disagreed about things, but nothing bad. I mean, he was a professional. If you set up the microphone wrong, you were going to have an argument with him or get told off. But everything was for the best. He was, look, everyone's got ups and downs and faults and things, but he was a really superb, perfect professional. And a very kind, generous person, caring person.
Yeah. And something which is obviously clear is how unhappy he was and the struggles that he had throughout the earlier years, perhaps hiding his sexuality. That was obviously very, very difficult for him.
Yeah, I mean, most artists have this inner angst, and they're never completely happy people. And the art comes from the fact that they're not completely happy. So almost by definition, if you're an artist, you're not going to be a person who's satisfied with life every day. But they find a balance, and that's one of the things that your manager has to do in helping them, is to find a balance between keeping that art, which means, in a way, keeping yourself sort of underlyingly a bit unhappy, and also enjoying life. It's a difficult balance, and he did it bit by bit. He did it better and better, and not coming out at the beginning. Well, I mean, even when he came out, he still had the same sort of tension within him. He was never completely comfortable with himself.
Mm. And Wham were completely unique, weren't they? It was kind of difficult to describe. They were somehow wholesome and sexy at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting because they were genuinely, in a pop way, something we've seen so often in movies, the bromance, the two buddies, the two cowboys who ride off into the sunset at the end of the film. Starsky and Hutch, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And actually, we'd never seen it in pop before. Those two absolute perfect friends very rarely come along. We had the Everly Brothers, but they were brothers. And anyway, off stage, they hated each other and fought the whole time. So Wham were really quite exceptional. Absolutely best friends from beginning to end.
Yeah, it's really lovely to see. And even though they stopped working together musically, they still stayed friends. There wasn't like a major fallout or anything, was there?
No, there was no rift, no upset. It's just that George had matured enough. They always planned for Wham to be 2 or 3 years. They cut it a bit shorter than they planned because he got very edgy about going on with it once he'd found his inner self, and he learnt stagecraft from Andrew, not the other way around. I mean, Andrew is the person who created the image of Wham, the happy-go-lucky kids around town. The music came from George, and it was a very good balance. But once George had learnt all he had to learn about stagecraft, he wanted to move on. And Andrew was perfectly happy with that. He said, we've done it. It was 3 years. It's a teenage act. You don't want to be a teenage act when you're no longer a teenager.
It's really amazing that Andrew had that reaction. He could have been really jealous. He could have been, backstabbing, and it could have turned really nasty. But it just shows how strong their friendship was, that Andrew was more than happy to step back and say, go on, George, this is your moment to shine.
Well, being famous isn't really much fun. Everyone thinks it'd be wonderful, but it's not. You don't get a moment to yourself. You can't wander around the supermarket and think about what you're going to buy. You're bothered. And, people pull at you and ask you for autographs and sneer at you and smile at you and take selfies. It's not fun. You think it's going to be fun, but in the end, you find it's not. And 2 or 3 years of it is enough. But stars go on all their lives with it because they have something else they need. They desperately need to be able to get up on a stage and get the love of that audience. And they want to create this music. And they're driven inside to do that. So they have to put up with what goes with it, which is the edgy part of fame, the interfering part of fame, where the public never give you any peace. So for Andrew, having done that for 3 years, he'd seen it. He'd had the fun of it. He'd begun to find it wearing. And George wanted to go off and do it the rest of his life. Andrew thought, well, up to you. I don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. So they were both very happy with the decision.
Yeah. And you were really kind of instrumental, the driving force behind their groundbreaking Beijing concert. They were the first to visit China, the first Western pop music act. And it went down really well, didn't it?
Well, the plan of China, we weren't really very interested in the Chinese market or anything like that. We were just trying to break them in America. But it seemed the quickest way to break them in America was to do something really quite enormously novel and new. The week they were in China, they were on the NBC and CBS and ABC news broadcasts 24/7, every hour on the hour. And by the end of that week, they were simply the biggest group in America. And 3 months later, we played a stadium tour. Just 1.5 years after their first record had come out. Normally that takes 5 or 6 years. So that was what China was for. But of course, it was always had its own fun, and it became a game to play, to go there and try to push the knowledge that they were there in China beyond just the audience in the stadium, and to spread the word amongst general Chinese. And to that end, we did, because we made records. We made a cassette of all the Wham songs in Mandarin on one side and with the Wham version on the other side. And we gave that away with the tickets, and gave a couple of cassettes with each ticket. And so everyone who bought a ticket got one cassette to listen to and one they could sell in the market. And then these were copied and pirated and black marketed. And so by the end of a year, there were millions of these cassettes going all around China. So we sort of undermined. We got youth culture into China as well as getting what we wanted from the American media.
Yeah. And something that not everyone necessarily will know is how much of an incredible songwriter he was. He wasn't always singing other people's songs. Most of the songs, he wrote himself.
He was a magnificent songwriter. I mean, from the very first early Wham songs. I mean, whether it's Careless Whisper, which is a song of such maturity for a 17-year-old to sing. It's like one of those songs. In fact, in the film, somebody says that it's like a Charles Aznavour song. It's a very mature adult love song. He wrote it at 17. Quite extraordinary. Wow. And then, brilliant pop hits like Last Christmas, which we still listen to every year. And it sustains in a way that other Christmas songs don't, because it's not about Christmas trees and jingle bells. It's about, it's just like a teenage hurt love story, which could quite easily not have been a Christmas song. And so it's got this double-edged thing of being both Christmas and a sort of angst-driven teenage song. Fantastic bit of songwriting.
Yeah. I saw a clip of I think it was in the Wham documentary when they were talking about the filming of Last Christmas, and how they're all the friends are all sitting around there drinking, and they were actually given alcohol, so they were actually getting a little bit drunk whilst they were filming it.
It's not what you usually do when you film. You usually act it out. You can have a drink afterwards. They just drank from start to finish. By the time they were filming that, they were as drunk as they looked, or maybe even drunker, actually.
Brilliant. And also the people who you got involved in this documentary, The Real George Michael, Stevie Wonder, there's a lovely clip of him talking about working with George.
Yes, Stevie was lovely. I mean, the sad thing is you can't put everything into the film. We had 45 people. Most of them talked for an hour each. So that's 45 hours, and it had to come down to 90 minutes. And Stevie talked a lot, but, it had to be relevant to what we're telling, the story we're telling. So he didn't end up that much in it, but he always came up with wonderful key phrases. He has a knack of sort of speaking out one sentence which sums everything up. So you've got 7 or 8 of those in the film.
Yeah.
And Stephen Fry, who told a marvelous story about George donating all the royalties from his greatest hits album, which is probably his biggest selling album. I mean, it's about £20 million worth of royalties he gave to the Terence Higgins Trust, which is an AIDS charity. He was an extraordinarily generous man.
Yeah, a lot of these stories about the amount of money he gave to charity and the individuals that he helped as well came out following his death, didn't they? Because he didn't want people to know. He wanted to do all of this anonymously, which again says so much about him.
He would only do it anonymously. He towards the end of his life, he watched television a lot. He'd sit and watch talk shows, and somebody would be on, and their wife needed an operation, or they just lost their teeth and couldn't afford a new set of something. And he'd just phone up the radio station or television station and say, let me pay for whatever it is they need. The only condition is you can't say it's me. And he'd send the money anonymously. And he did this day after day, every day. And he really did give away millions of pounds.
Oh, amazing. You don't hear stories like that, do you? You really don't. He was one of a kind in so many ways.
Absolutely unique, yes.
Yeah. So how long does it take to put a documentary like this together?
Well, if COVID comes in the middle, a long time. We started in 2019 and we more or less almost finished shooting by the end of the year. And then COVID came along. And we couldn't get in the studio to do post-production because of COVID. And we hadn't quite finished filming either. So, it was, what do we do? Do we put it off? And in the end, we didn't get it finished till 2 years later. I mean, it came out the beginning of this year, nearly 3 years. So that's a lot longer than it should take. Normally, it would take about a year to make a film like that.
Yeah. And how does it compare with writing books? I know you've written some fabulous books on the music industry and your time in the music industry as well. How does making a documentary with so many other people involved compare to being on your own writing a book?
There's a huge difference. Writing is not fun or entertaining when you do it, but it's lovely to have written the book. So there's nothing nicer than sitting talking to people like you about the book you've written and hearing people say how much they enjoyed it. That's a real pleasure. But writing it isn't much of a pleasure. Films is quite the opposite. Making the film is a huge pleasure. It's very sociable. You're meeting people every day. It's challenging. You're swapping ideas, working with creative people who are doing the lighting and the cameraman. So films is an absolute pleasure to do, and a pleasure after it's finished, but probably more of a pleasure to do than afterwards, whereas books, the pleasure comes afterwards.
And is there another book in the pipeline from you, do we think?
Oh, I think there has to be. I mean, I sort of don't want to because nobody really wants to sit down and write, but it's in me, it's a bit like artists and their songs. There's another one I need to write, and I've got to sit down and think about it in the next few weeks. And probably at the beginning of next year, sit down and get it written, which will be 3 or 4 months hard work.
Oh, well, good luck with it. We look forward to it. In the meantime, listeners have to watch the new documentary if they haven't seen it already. It's available on all the usual outlets. It's called The Real George Michael, and it's been directed by Simon Napier Bell, who we've been chatting with today. Simon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Hannah. It's a big pleasure.